The Shabbat, we read the third parasha of the Torah, Parashat Lecha. When we began the Torah 2 weeks ago, we read about the creation of the world, about the first human beings on the planet, Adam and Chava, the Garden of Eden, the first murder between Cain and Abel. So not only was it a murder, it was a fratricide. Last week we read about the story of Noah and the ark, Noah and the flood, how God decides that God's had enough with the misbehavior of human beings, that God's going to destroy the world and start again, and floods the world. And Noah is given the task of saving remnants of life, his family and some animals, and then repopulating the world once the flood waters have subsided. And now the Torah hones in on a specific family, the family of Avram and Sarai. In last week's Torah portion, we are told that God chose Noah because he was a righteous man in his generation. And there are many opinions as to what that means in rabbinic literature. So some say he was righteous in his generation, but he lived in a generation like the generation of Abraham, then he wouldn't be so righteous. And others say, no, he was righteous despite his generation. He was always a righteous man, whichever generation, and especially in this wicked generation that he lived. It's interesting that the Torah says that Noah walked with God, whereas in our Torah portion this week, God tells Abraham to walk before him, to walk before God, in front of God. And there's a difference. So rabbis explain the difference in a midrash, when they make an analogy between a parent and their toddler. When a toddler is very small and is first starting to walk, the parent will walk with the child, will hold the child's hand and they'll walk together along the way. But as the toddler grows up and becomes a child, and they're more independent, they can walk in front of the parent. The parent watches them and they fall, they walk in front of the parent. So similarly, the rabbis say that while Noah was a righteous man, he wasn't spiritually developed enough to walk in front of God. He had to walk with God. But Abraham Avinu was spiritually elevated and mature enough to show the way, to guide people towards God. So he walked in front of God. But I want to look at the opening verse of our Torah portion, where God says to Avram, as he's then known, Lecha me'atzecha u'moladatecha mi'beit avicha el ha'aretz asher ar'eka. You must go, set forth is translated as, from your land, from your father's house, from your place of birth, to a land which I will show you. But if you look at the Hebrew Lech Lecha, you translate it literally, it means go towards yourself. From your land, from your place of birth, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. In other words, you should look inward and undergo change of perspective. According to the Midrash, which is reflected also in Pirkei Avot, in the Mishnah, Abraham went through 10 trials. God tested Abraham 10 times. It's akin to the 10 trials of Hercules in the Greek mythology. Abraham had 10 trials. What were they? Well, they're difference of opinion. Like everything in Judaism, there's always different opinions. But Rambam, the famous Rambam, Moses Maimonides, enumerated them as follows. First of all, Lech Lecha, God tells Avram to emigrate, to leave all that he known, his culture, his family home, and go to a place which God will show him. So many people have these days emigrated or continue to migrate, but at least they know where they're going. Avram had no idea. God would show him the way. So God was his GPS, and he relied on God to show him the way. So that was a test. As soon as he arrives in the land of Israel, the land of Canaan, he faces his second test. There's a famine in the land. Avram decides to leave the land of Canaan, to escape the famine with his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, who went with them to the land of Israel, all his belongings. He goes down to Egypt. So that's the second challenge, is the famine. He has to leave. He's just arrived and he has to leave, or he feels he has to leave. Third challenge, the third test, is that Sarai is very beautiful, and Avram is afraid that Pharaoh might lust after her and kill him if he knew that he, Avram, was Sarai's husband. So he convinces Sarai to tell people that she's his sister. So that if Pharaoh takes her into his harem, he'll spare Avram. And that's what happens. So the third test is that Avram sees Sarah being dragged off to this king's harem. According to the Torah, Pharaoh has a dream at night where God appears to him and says, what you're about to do with that woman you brought in, that Hebrew woman Sarai, is sinful, it's adultery because she's married to Avram. And so he, next morning, summons Avram and says, I nearly committed sin because of you. Take your wife and go, and I'll give you some treasures as well. And according to the Midrash, he gives Sarai, this Egyptian daughter, his own daughter, Hagar, which the Torah tells us Hagar was an Egyptian maidservant or slave, becomes Sarah's slave. So Pharaoh gives them his own daughter as a parting gift. He arrives back in the land of Canaan, and there are 4 kings that decide to plunder the land, to take belongings, and they kidnap Lot, Avram's nephew. So that is the 4th test. Avram has to go into battle against these 4 kings. He goes into battle with 318 men, and he manages to get his nephew back from captivity, and he also defeats the 4 kings as well. Sarai is barren. She cannot have children. And so she takes a very practical approach to the problem and instructs Abraham to sleep with Sarah's slave Hagar. And she'll then bear a child, and that child will be legally Sarah's because Sarah owns Hagar. So the 5th test is taking Hagar as a concubine. He loved Sarah. He was upset that Sarah couldn't have a child, and he listens to Sarah and takes Hagar. So it's considered to be a test. Sometimes most men wouldn't think it is a test, but Rambam believes it's a test. Then, when Abraham is very old, we're told he's in his 90s, he's visited by God, and God tells him to circumcise his son Ishmael and all the men in his camp, including himself. At his ripe old age of 99, he has to be circumcised, and that's considered to be a big test, which it probably is. So that's the 6th test. Then, after he's healed, he travels down to the south to a kingdom called Gerar. The king of Gerar is Avimelech. And once again, Abraham tells Avimelech that Sarah is his sister, not his wife. And so Avimelech takes her into his harem, and that's the 7th test. Of course, Sarah is unharmed and is returned by Avimelech to Abraham. Sarah eventually gives birth to her own son, her biological son, Yitzchak, and she wants to get rid of Ishmael, whom she sees as a threat. According to the Torah, she sees the 2 of them playing, Ishmael and Yitzchak playing, and so she goes to Abraham and says, you need to banish your son, Ishmael, from the camp, together with his mother. So expulsion of Hagar, who Abraham became fond of, was the 8th test. And of course, losing his son, Ishmael, is the 9th test. And the last test, the 10th test, the Torah tells us, in fact, that God tested Abraham to take his only remaining son, his loved one, Yitzchak, and to offer him on the altar as a sacrifice. And that last test uses the phrase Lech Lecha again. God said, take your son, your only one, the one you love, Isaac, making sure that he understands it's Isaac that needs to be taken. Lech Lecha, El Eretz HaMoriah, and go forth towards the land of Moriah, or go to yourself to the land of Moriah. V'alehu sham la'olah, and offering up there is a burnt offering, al echad ha'arim asher amar alecha, on one of the mountains which I tell you. So Rabbi Bachya, who is a medieval commentator on the Torah, points out that the first test begins with Lech Lecha, go from your birthplace, from your father's house, from your land to a land which I will show you. And the last test also, Lech Lecha, take your son and go, perhaps go to yourself, to land of Moriah and sacrifice your son. Of course, we know the story very well because that story is read on Rosh Hashanah. At the last minute, before Abraham is about to slaughter his son, God stops him and says, don't harm the child. So instead, Abraham offers up a ram that he sees, it's always been there, but through his being so upset and his determination to sacrifice his son despite himself to show his faith to God, he doesn't see another way out. He doesn't see the alternative. He doesn't see the ram until God says, stop what you're doing. And then he's relieved, and then he sees the ram, and he offers the ram instead of his son. So what does Lech Lecha mean? Go to yourself. It means to examine yourself, to grow as a person, to change your perspective of life, to adapt. Lech Lecha me'artzecha, go from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's house. Trust in me, I will show you where you're going to settle. It takes a lot of courage, a lot of introspection. Am I courageous enough to do what has been asked of me? Am I courageous enough to leave what I know and start something new? Am I courageous enough to teach the world a new idea about a God that's compassionate and kind and life-affirming? And his last test again, Lech Lecha, am I courageous enough? Am I have enough faith to sacrifice my only remaining son? The second paragraph of our Torah portion says that if you go to the place I'll show you, Ve'esecha l'goy gadol, I shall make you into a great nation, Va'avechecha va'gadla shemecha va'ya bracha, and I shall bless you, and I shall increase your name, and you shall be a bracha, you shall be a blessing. Looking inwards to himself, testing his courage and his faith, he becomes a blessing to the nations. In this world, which is often dark and frightening, this world of violence and hate, and we be inspired by Abraham and Sarah, inspired by their courage, by their faith, by their belief in the goodness of God and the goodness of humanity, despite the challenges they faced. May we be strong like Abraham, who the Midrash says God tested only because Abraham was strong. May we have that courage to be a blessing to the world. Can you hear it, son?